The practice of hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, has swept across the nation and the world like a destructive storm, leaving destroyed land, poisoned air and water, and ruined health in its wake. Here, Oaklandsocialist interviews Cliff Willmeng, one of the leading fracking opponents, or fractivists, in Colorado. Cliff helped get fracking banned in Lafayette, Colorado, where he lives, and is helping push a community rights initiative in the entire state.
That we were going to be moving onto a shale formation and essentially undertaking the fight of our lives. And I live in Lafayette, Colorado, which sits on the western part of the Wattenberg Shale. The Wattenberg Shale is one of the main oil and gas drilling areas within Colorado. It's if you're in the industry, it's nationally famous. Community Lafayette, Colorado, after a whole lot of deliberation and the organization of a local grassroots campaign here, essentially took on a local ballot initiative that banned the practice of hydraulic fracturing. We did more than that. We actually banned all oil and gas development. We banned the disposal of associated industrial wastes. And we did so with the full knowledge that the state and the Colorado Oil and Gas Association were threatening to sue any community that took any kind of stand against oil and gas development. So Lafayette is not alone in this endeavor. And essentially, in 2013, there were 4 communities that took action against oil and gas, whether it was a prolonged moratorium or a ban on the process altogether. Lafayette was sued by the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, as was Longmont and Broomfield and Fort Collins. And that's essentially where the conflict really lies right now. At one point, the governor was suing one of his own municipalities on behalf of the oil and gas industry. He was a paid spokesperson for the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. So, what we're supposed to believe is that this is the state being diplomatic with us, when in fact, their friends in the oil and gas industry are moving full steam ahead with threats on any community that stands in the way of them developing their shale. But right now, we see very little difference between the parties in terms of any kind of substantial support of the communities and who makes the determination of where these rigs land. So in Lafayette, what we learned very rapidly was that a fight against the oil and gas industry is essentially a fight against the legal system that industry uses to force itself upon communities. And that same legal system is utilized by coal mines, uranium mines, injection wells, GMOs, and so our objective essentially was not just to fight fracking, but to fight those legal privileges that the oil and gas corporations enjoy and that are utilized ultimately to intervene in community decisions to protect our own health. So in the process of that, we ultimately decided that we needed to field a state ballot initiative that would allow communities to have legal superiority to corporate power. Colorado. We've gone from Greeley to Fort Collins to Huerfano County and Alamosa, the Western Slope, Grand Junction, Denver, Boulder. And that presentation essentially talks about how these communities are undermined or how our response is, scripted by the oil and gas industry and by, to some extent, mainstream conventional environmentalism and both parties in the political system. I mean, these will be farmers, kind of middle-class office workers. They tend to be residents of Colorado for an extended period of time. And so, yeah, it's actually the spectrum of involvement is actually quite wide-ranging. People would consider themselves Republicans, Democrats, so across the political spectrum, but mainly working-class folks. Sometimes the oil and gas industry actually becomes our best organizer, and really, it's just been through them utterly throttling these communities that have compelled people into action around this. And every day that goes by, the system reveals itself for what it is a little bit larger, and people become disillusioned. And so that typically is the first kind of wave of people that get involved.
Cliff talks about the relationship between fracking and the capitalist system.
You know, fracking, I think, is kind of the natural extension of capitalism. When you start to address the idea of fracking, when you start to kind of pull it apart, and you realize that this is an industry that is completely engineered for short-term profit, it's mandated to do exactly that. Obviously, oil and gas being an enormous component to any world power like the United States. And so it's not been with a slight amount of determination that the oil and gas industry has confronted communities. It's been with the determination of a major superpower that needs this stuff to extend itself, extend what I would consider an empire. And, you know, really coming from a local's perspective, it's not really till you start to get to address the realities of that system, both the oil and gas industry and the system of capitalism that that forces it on us, that you start to get a sense of the systemic problem, nature of the problem here. And so, you know, to us here in Lafayette, it would be very difficult to talk about a world that does not have fracking without dealing with the system that's forcing it everywhere upon us. You know, like I said, it's kind of a larger question, but you know, until the decision-making power is vested really in the people, and those kind of corporate laws that aid the global capitalist Wall Street industries are done away with, you know, we don't look at that. We don't look at those two things as reconcilable. So, you know, what we consistently say is, you know, where fracking and democracy cannot coexist, one of them always must go. Right. And of course, those folks of us, those people in Lafayette and on Colorado's Front Range, have one idea of what's going to go, and Wall Street and Anadarko Petroleum have quite a different idea. Those workers in the oil and gas industry that are oftentimes the most immediate and obvious victims of this industry. I know right now, you know, what we said before is that the moment this industry isn't making money, those workers are going to be the first people that feel the consequences of that.
They already are.
And many are. Thousands are. And, you know, where the oil and gas industry wants to create legislation that would mandate communities compensate it for any loss in expected revenue for, you know, if we were to ban fracking to prohibit them from getting to their mineral resources, they're certainly not compensating these thousands of workers that are now unemployed and more than likely looking for health care and a means to pay the mortgage.
Cliff talks about the relationship between fracking and the trade deal known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
It flies 180 degrees to the opposite of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which essentially is an international trade agreement that takes power from the local governments, the state governments, and now the national governments, and transfers it to very unresponsive tribunals that aren't even located nationally. So, you know, our aim very clearly is, you know, in the sometimes very predictable event that the politicians of both parties are unresponsive to the needs of these communities, I think that it's our obligation to make those kind of trade agreements fully unenforceable. The conflict will tend to be, at all times, that between people, and I believe that the labor force is a big part of that, and the people that own the banks and the industry. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership is the voice of those class interests, and the Colorado Community Rights Amendment would be the natural class interest of the working class and the communities in Colorado. We've recently been contacted by people protesting fracking in Mexico. Argentina is another big country that is being targeted. I think it's by Chevron. And so that would be the natural tendency.
Cliff talks about the Colorado Community Rights Initiative.
Is you can't frack here because it's the right of our people. And so, you know, that's the inevitable conflict that you'll get. But we're actually quite clear in every respect that, that rights can't be taken away through this process. It's a one-way valve. Rights can be created, the democratic rights in the workplace can be created. A woman's right to access of reproductive care, which is currently not a right for women. They can do it if they can afford it, but it's certainly not a right. It's a privilege right now. And so what we're trying to do is actually expand the ideas of what fundamental rights are in terms of people and communities and the natural environment. And that's inevitably going to come at the cost of corporations.
We asked Cliff about the relationship between the struggle for community rights in Colorado and against fracking and the struggle against police brutality and against racism, such as what we saw in Ferguson.
When Ferguson exploded, which we look at as an advancement of as the community, well, I don't want to call it the community rights movement because it's not. It's a movement against police brutality. But that effort and those protests that stepped outside of what was typically expected, meaning that they created direct action, they shut down highways, they did more than just protest. They actually intervened. We have always seen that as a something that advances the whole level of struggle across the country. And to be quite frank, if you don't have the right to walk down the street without getting shot by the police, there's really no community rights at all. So, you know, in Lafayette, community rights might mean that, you know, we're going to be able to breathe free of benzene, air free of benzene, and what that might mean in places like New York or Ferguson is that you're allowed to breathe without getting shot by the local police department. So we see it as one of the same.
We asked Cliff why he and Mary moved from Chicago to Colorado.
The motivation for moving to Colorado was to find a nice, clean, and tranquil place to raise our kids. We moved out here, and I've had a background in political activism. I was out in Seattle during the World Trade Organization protests. I was a rank-and-file organizer in the Carpenters Union, and have done work against the Iraq War. And, you know, quite frankly, we told ourselves that we were going to be walking away from political life and committing to an existence of boring suburban parenthood. And we've probably never failed at something so greatly. We had no concept, absolutely no concept moving out here that we were going to be moving onto a shale formation and essentially undertaking the fight of our lives.